Hello everybody, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. We're going to jump back into reviews with this episode, starting off with two entries from the Legendary Encounters line. This first guy's a Dwarf Warrior, and you can see he's carrying a shield and a hammer. Predominant colors are blue and brown. A lighter brown for the beard and a darker brown for the furs that he's wearing and his fur cape. Blues for part of his armor and also the tassel on his helmet. There is a little bit of gold in there also and a little bit of silver, but like I said, predominantly blue and brown. The paint job is okay. Pretty much what you'd expect for a pre-painted plastic figure. There are some areas that you probably want to go over yourself. The flesh could probably use a little bit of a wash, and the irises need dotting just with a little tiny dab of blue or brown or a color like that. There are some places where it's either over or underpainted, just depending on what order they did the colors in. Along where he's carrying the hammer, there's some extra blue that's actually on his hand itself, and the beard could use a little bit of touching up. But it's, like I said, it's okay for a pre-painted figure. If you're just going to use it for an occasional RPG character, I could see you just picking him up, not worrying about dinging the miniature when you carry it around or anything, so for that purpose it's alright. Next we have three plastic kobolds, and I would rate these a little bit higher than the dwarf. I think they came out a little bit better from the pre-painting process that they go through. There are some areas that need to be touched up. You can see on their blue clothing, their leather armor that they're wearing, there's some areas that are still brown, so you might touch them up a little bit there, and a little bit on some of the weapons might benefit from being touched up. But overall, I think if you just needed a bunch of little guys to throw in a dungeon against a party of adventurers, that's what these guys are ideal for. Their eyes are the same color blue as the leather armor they're wearing, so I would probably go in and repaint those yellow or a bright red, but I do like the kobolds quite a bit. Next up is a figure from the Pathfinder line. This is Chivane, a red Mantis assassin. And in a previous episode we looked at a red Mantis assassin that had what ends up being the helmet on, and I thought of it more as an insectoid type warrior that you could use in a Dark Sun campaign. A viewer actually mentioned that they are not insectoid, that's their helmet. So here she is carrying helmet off to her side and also has a sword, a serrated edged sword in her left hand. And without the helmet on, she looks a lot like an elf to me, has the pointy ears sticking out from under her hair. Has several daggers about her person that are strapped in for close quarters fighting, and is also wearing a long cloak in addition to the somewhat insectoid looking armor that she's got on. Now I do think the previous one that we looked at would work for an insectoid warrior. She would not, just because she's carrying the helmet, but I think she would work fine as a pretty unique looking fighter or rogue type character in a non-Pathfinder game. Obviously in Pathfinder, using her as a red Mantis assassin is what she's intended for, but I think you could probably eke some other uses out of her in other fantasy games. Now from the Warlord line, we have a blister that contains two single-piece figures. This is for the Bloodstone Gnomes faction, and we have Szerda, a priestess, and what looks like a little pot or cauldron where she's conjuring up some kind of spectral being. Szerda has both hands in the air, and looks like she's conjuring or casting a spell, an invocation or something like that. The most striking part about this figure is her helmet and the runes that she's wearing about her. The helmet is very, I guess you could sort of say, geometric and blocky, very Aztec kind of fashion, at least to me it looks that way. But from the side, it also looks like the top or the front part of the helmet is supposed to look like a piranha. So I found that to be a very interesting feature of the model. There's lots of little runes that she's wearing all over the place, and these are sculpted very well to where you could pick them out easily when painting them. The cauldron or pot or little vessel that she's got with her has it's about five ghostly apparitions that are kind of floating out of it or emanating from it. So to me this looks like some kind of spell effect. I think the figure herself, Szerda, could be used as a good dwarf player character model if you're not running a Bloodstone Gnome army. You might be able to work her in as a rune priest or priestess in a Warhammer Fantasy Battle dwarf army. The armor that she's wearing wouldn't necessarily go with regular dwarves, but it might make a nice standout character in an otherwise regular unit of dwarves. And here we have Togha the Despoiler. It's from the Kargir faction for Warlord, and it's a gnoll, and you probably know by now I'm a fan of all things gnoll. It comes in 3 pieces and has a 40mm base, so it's quite a bit larger than a standard man-sized or human-sized gnoll. The bulk of the figure is the body and the legs, and appears to be some kind of shaman. He's got one arm that carries a staff that's made of several sections of bone, and the detail on this is really, really good. It's got all sorts of little runes or inscriptions on the bone itself, so if you paint it white and then wash it with flesh wash, I thought of first, but then if you wash it with red or a blue to seep into the inscriptions and then go over the rest of the bone itself back with white again, that might make it stand out and look really cool. It's definitely a good all-around gnoll figure, probably used in D&D as a champion of a warband or something like that, a boss kind of gnoll against an adventuring party if you're not going to use it in a game of Warlord. And while it doesn't really fit into the motif of the Beastmen in Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I could see maybe swapping it in as a different kind of Beastman for a Chaos Warband or something like that. Next up we have a group of Townsfolk that I think all gamers will probably recognize at some point, maybe even at your local game store. You get 3 single-piece miniatures in this blister, and the first one that we're looking at here is the fairly stereotypical overweight gamer with his belly coming out between his shorts and his shirt. Now we've got our female gamer that you probably don't see a whole lot of, but when you do, it's a sight that you make note of. This guy here is our sort of bookworm gamer, and he has a striking resemblance to Brian from Reaper Miniatures. And here's a look at the 3 of them going around. They're all carrying either books or a laptop or something like that. The rotund gamer has what I would venture to guess is a very large Mountain Dew that he's carrying. Beverage staple for gamers worldwide. And while you might not have a huge amount of use for these guys in a typical game, you could use them in a modern day game as victims that need to be rescued. You could use them in a superhero game as gawkers who come out of their comic book store and see superheroes in front of them and don't know what to do, or, you know, zombie apocalypse game or something like that. So while you don't have a whole lot of fantasy or sci-fi use for them necessarily, they're kind of cool in a geeky sort of way. Also from the Chronoscope line, we have Captain Nemo. It's a single-piece sculpt of a bearded, seafaring captain, as you can tell by the picture in the video here. He's carrying a large harpoon gun in both hands, kind of cradling it, and he's wearing what looks like a slicker and boots that you'd be wearing on the deck of a ship. First thing I thought of is he'd be very easily convertible into a figure for an alternate World War II game. If you wanted to convert or spend a little bit of time messing with his harpoon gun, turn it into a flamethrower, or even some kind of high-tech laser rifle or something like that, that'd be a real easy conversion. So it's a good all-around figure. Didn't really need too much attention before he's ready to base and prime and paint. And I think you could probably find a use for him in, like I mentioned, a World War II kind of game. You could use him in Call of Cthulhu even, or even in a sci-fi game, just depending on how you painted him and if you really wanted to convert anything on him. And our last figure for this episode is going to be a dwarf. His name is Horgun Blackfletch. And it's kind of a unique dwarf in that he's carrying a bow instead of a more stereotypical crossbow that you see with a lot of dwarves, or most dwarves that I see. I really don't see them with bows. I'll see a handgun or a crossbow more than anything else. Anyway, Horgun is carrying a bow. He's got a quiver on his back, and you can see that he's wearing pretty substantial armor. He's got a chain vest on and at least leather on along with it. He's got a metal helmet, very big bushy beard like you'd see on most dwarves. And I really think the bow adds a pretty neat, unique feature, or very unusual feature to him, being a dwarf with a bow. I don't know that I'd use him in a unit or a whole unit of dwarf archers, but as a player character, I think he'd fit a nice little unique niche as a ranged fighter or something like that. Alright everybody, thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. We'll see you soon with more reviews.